What happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
Welcome back, everyone, to Best Day Ever, BDE episode number 14. I'm excited to have you guys here. Also, just want to humble brag. I think I'm live on every single platform that I want to be live on today. So that's fantastic. If you guys are watching this on Rumble or Facebook, they've been giving me some problems this week. Leave a comment. I would just appreciate the feedback if you guys can hear and see me. If you're watching this on YouTube, again, jump in the comment section. We always want to create this as a two-way conversation with you guys. But I've got a lot of stories I want to go over with you guys for today's show. Reminder, Adam is away. He's hunting moose in Northern Ontario. He will be back next week. But let's jump into it. So I want to talk to you guys about a variety of different subject matters. We're going to be hitting upon Canada's first carbon tracking visa. Liz Truss resigns in regards to UK politics. We've also going to be diving into a little bit of Canadian crime statistics. But before we do that, let's just hit upon our quick story updates, get into a couple WTF stories, and we'll go from there. So the first quick story update I want to give you guys is around the Emergencies Act. And again, this is from True North. I really appreciate the reporting that True North is doing on all this. So I encourage you guys, if you're not signed up to True North, go over, check them out. They're one of my consistent tabs, I guess, that I open every morning when I'm doing my news roundup in order to put together this show. So, OPP officer says no intel of convoy violence, day 5. Recap of Emergencies Act hearing. So, on day 5 of the Emergencies Act hearings, explosive cross-examination of Ontario Provincial Police OPP intelligence officer Pat Morris confirmed that that there was no intelligence that indicated the Freedom Convoy met the legal threshold required for the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act. This is a direct quote. I saw online rhetoric. I saw information on social media. I saw assertions of that type of activity. I'm aware of no intelligence that was produced that would support concerns in that regard. And so this is in regards to whether the Emergencies Act should be invoked, whether there was a real threat here in Ottawa during the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters. And again, it's worth going through this entire article to get all the details. I just wanted to pick out a few highlights that stood out to me. Morris dismissed concerns that protesters were armed in Ottawa as hyperbole, saying, "We produced no intelligence to indicate that these individuals, protesters, would be armed. There has been a lot of hyperbole around that," Morris said under questioning from Commission Counsel. So as this inquiry goes on, and as the facts have just slowly came out ever since February 14th, when the Emergencies Act was originally enacted here in Canada, it seems like all the justifications are slowly eroding. And it's so frustrating because mainstream media immediately pushed all these narratives forward. I may be misremembering here, but I'm pretty sure if you go back and look at global news, they had stories about potentially guns being in some of the trucks and things of that nature. Again, oftentimes these news articles would then be cited by members of parliament. And what we ended up having was this vicious cycle of like hearsay, essentially, where a reporter would kind of put something out that was relatively speculative or an opinion piece, or we'd get like a weird anecdotal story with no actual proof. And then immediately that would be brought up in the House of Commons by a member of parliament as justification for why the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters were unacceptable, for why they were racist, misogynist, anti-vaxxers, anti-science, all that stuff. Pretty much, all the bad words that Trudeau likes to hurl at any of his political opponents. Further on in the article, asked about threats and criminal activity occurring in the convoy prior to January 28th, Morris said that the absolute lack of criminal activity was conspicuous. There was almost no reported criminal activity of any of the activity coming across Canada. Morris said under questioning from Commission Counsel, so it was conspicuous for the absolute lack of criminal activity. So this is something that we talked about when this was live breaking news back in February of 2022, where I was talking about how crime statistics actually appeared to be going down in the weekly reporting from Ottawa police in regards to downtown Ottawa and all that. And yet we were constantly hearing, and we even had testimony from individual citizens that were brought forward in this Emergencies Act inquiry, where they said essentially it was like the purge. You guys, like, I never watched The Purge because it looked stupid to me, but I got the gist of it. People literally were killing and raping for 12 hours, if I understand correctly, what The Purge was about. Crime went down. We're literally hearing from the OPP that there was an absolute lack of criminal activity in association with this. And yet, this was the greatest threat to our democracy that we've experienced in living memory. Let that sink in. This is absolutely wild, in my opinion, that we saw the Emergencies Act enacted against these protesters. Further on, although Morris testified that the protest never reached the OPP's threshold of a threat to national security, the protest and intelligence reports were labeled a potential threat to national security in part because, as is written in an OPP intelligence report, the threat to Canada's reputation by virtue of coverage in the international media of what was transpiring in Canada. So let's review that again. Let's really get to that. Threat to Canada's reputation by virtue of coverage in the international media of what was transpiring in Canada. So in the intelligence report, that was essentially identified or labeled as a potential threat because it was embarrassing our government. So now, if you embarrass the government, if you call out the emperor has no clothes, that actually could be considered a threat, according to intelligence reports. Apparently, based upon everything we've read so far through these 5 days, CISA said there was no real threat. The OPP saying there's no real threat. We're hearing from Ottawa police that there was no real threat. But in intelligence reports, they're labeling it a potential threat because, hey, it's actually embarrassing to us that we've got these people demanding their freedoms. We've got these people really questioning vaccine mandates. Not only whether we should be doing it, but whether they're even effective in the first place. This is just absolutely wild, in my opinion. Like, if this doesn't frustrate you, if this doesn't grind your gears, you are not paying attention to what's going on in this country. And yeah, we really need to start waking up, Canada. We need to start taking this shit seriously, because this is just one more partial descent down that slippery slope that I'm always talking about. So again, really encourage you guys spend some time and sink your teeth into this True North article because you need to understand what's going on because this is just wild. Like, again, it appears that the only person, and from day one, he decided this was the case, was Justin Trudeau that decided this was an absolute threat to our democracy and these people had to be shut down because they disagreed with him. And Justin Trudeau knows Justin Trudeau's good. So therefore, anyone that disagrees with Justin Trudeau must be bad. That's just logic, right? Next update story I want to give you guys here. Canada's first carbon tracking Visa credit card to be launched in 2023. This is from the West. Oh, I guess they're calling it the West Coast Standard now. It used to be the Western Standard. I wonder why they did that. As another step in its commitment to climate action, Van City says it is introducing a program allowing Visa credit card holders to track the estimated carbon emissions attached to their purchases, which it says is first in Canada. Begin in 2023, the credit union says the carbon counter will help members understand their carbon footprint, allowing them to compare their monthly tally to the national average. Now, technically, if you want to participate optionally in this sort of program, I've got no issue with that, technically. However, I'm very concerned that this eventually is going to become the norm. And once it becomes the norm, it's going to become the standard. Once it's the standard, it's literally just going to be by fiat or by decree that this has to be the case, that you have to track your carbon footprint. And we'll see what sort of carrots and sticks the government decides to come out with afterwards in regards to what your climate footprint looks like. Again, I don't like this. I will not participate in it. If I was and we've talked about this previously, but if I was a member of the Van City Credit Union, I'd be pulling my shit. I'd be going to a different bank. Is that other bank going to be perfect? No, but they're probably going to be a little bit less less ESG scorey than what we're seeing from Van City right now. And right now, as a citizen, as a consumer, that's one of the only options available to us is to vote with our dollars, vote with your feet. And so I really encourage you guys, like, we all need to start participating more in society, right? It it's too late if we simply wait for politicians to dictate the social norms in our country. Before we do this BDE episode every single day, I actually co-host with my buddies Dan, and usually Adam's there, but again, Adam's out moose hunting, a hour and a half NFT Twitter space. So if you guys aren't familiar, Twitter essentially has like a competitor to Clubhouse. You may also not know what Clubhouse is, but essentially it's a Twitter spaces are audio spaces where people can go on and chat about whatever they want. And so for an hour and a half every day, we talk about what's going on in the NFT world and NFT culture. And one of the things that's really concerning to me is in NFT culture, there's a lot of bad actors. And these bad actors are able to milk the communities and the environment for millions of dollars through, pump and dump and rug pull scams. And it seems like recently a lot of large platforms on Twitter spaces in the NFT community are choosing to chase engagement versus trying to really inform and protect their audiences. Now, technically, I don't think that you've got an obligation to protect your audience, but I personally want to be the sort of content creator that tries to at least protect their audience. And so it's concerning for me when I constantly see bad actors being platformed on Twitter. However, a lot of people will push back in regards to my opinions on this and say things, along or to the nature of, well, if they haven't been charged, if they're not in jail, we should give them, freedom of speech. Isn't that what you're all about, Matt? I'm absolutely for freedom of speech in the public comments, right? And the public square. However, you as an individual content creator have no obligation to choose to platform bad actors, right? On my real estate investing channel, I would regularly choose not to do interviews or videos with individuals that I was suspect of. I maybe didn't have a smoking gun. I maybe didn't have a criminal report on them in order to point to exactly what they were doing. But I'd often hear anecdotal stories from handfuls of individuals that would allow me to come to the conclusion that, hey, there's probably better guests that I can bring on my channel that don't have this checkered past or that aren't potentially bad actors in the space. And that's the same way here in the NFT Twitter spaces. And it's the same thing right now going on in our culture day to day here in Canada. We each have an obligation to try and represent the social mores and the ethics that we want to see. And if you're not actively participating in society, if you're not actively trying to push society in the right direction, understand that others will be, and they're getting to choose the narrative. Politics is always downstream of culture. And right now, I think that a lot of individuals are still missing the point of why these culture wars are so important, why I literally think it's so important that I dedicate so much time every single day to create this content. Um, so, anyways, I'll get off the Van City rant here, but I encourage those of you that are members of them to maybe reconsider whether you want to be a member of that credit union, particularly if they see this as, such a key step in their commitment to climate action. Now, technically, there's nothing wrong with people understanding the size of their climate footprint, right? Or their carbon footprint. However, it's just, I'm very concerned with what that data may eventually be used for. So make sure you're really reading that user agreement if you decide to proceed with such a program. Next, this is from a Substack called Common Sense. Scheduled to Die, the rise of Canada's assisted suicide program. So we've talked about the MAID program here a little bit already previous episodes. I just want to highlight this fantastic article that covers a lot of the subject matter that we've discussed briefly, as well as goes into a very specific case. And this is from Rupa Submarana, and she writes fantastic articles. I'm always a big fan and appreciate her perspectives and points. What do you do when you discover your son has made an appointment for his death? So that's later on in the article where they really get in depth about a parent's experience around that. It, you know, we've talked about there are certain safeguards in place, but I think the real conversation right now that's being had in public discourse is, are those robust enough? Do people truly understand that there's no undo button when it comes to assisted suicide or assisted dying? So I'll leave it to you guys if you want to sink your teeth into it. This is a very thorough or large article here, but I think it's worthwhile to spend some time, inform yourselves, and get an additional perspective on the subject matter. All right, now let's jump over to Zero Head. White House not going to comment after Stacey Abrams suggests abortion is not a culture war issue, but an inflation issue. So the TLDR here is essentially Stacey Abrams said poor people should abort their kids. Maybe that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but not by much. Abrams, most known for her hypocritical election denial of Georgia's 2018 governor's race. And again, reminder, you're not allowed to critique or call into question the 2020 election, but every election before that, technically, it was fair game. Claims on MSNBC that abortion is not a culture war issue, but an economic issue and links parenthood to increased poverty. But let's be clear, having children is, and this is a direct quote from her, but let's be clear, having children is why you're worried about your price for gas. It's why you're concerned about how much food costs. For women, this is not a reductive issue. She told MSNBC on Wednesday morning, you can't divorce being forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy from the economic realities of having a child. Abrams added that for women of childbearing age, having a child is absolutely an economic issue. Now, if I want to give her the benefit of the doubt here, I would say that she misspoke or said the wrong things here. And maybe her intentions were to say, like, look, there's economic realities that come along with becoming a parent. You likely are going to end up having to spend more as a parent than you would as a single individual. And so, people, when choosing whether to become a parent or not, shouldn't be oblivious to those economic realities. That would be the version I would frame this as if I was trying to be extremely generous here. However, I'm not sure that I want to be generous when it comes to Stacey Abrams in this exact quote. It's actually wild, right? Like, it seems like the compassionate left have gone so far left that they somehow ended up on the fascist right, where they almost kind of believe in eugenics as well, right? We already talked about the assisted dying here in Canada programs that primarily target people that have disabilities, right? That aren't able to live a full life according to what like normal people live, or people that are economically constrained, people that deal with mental health issues and things of that nature. It's kind of a version of eugenics if you think about it, right? You're literally removing these people. You're not just taking away their life, but you're obviously taking away their opportunity to reproduce if they were to do so, right? Because you can't have children if you die. So anyways, this is fascinating. I don't think this is going to be political suicide for her, but it really is bizarre to see this narrative. It's really interesting. I think the Democrats thought that Roe versus Wade was going to be a much bigger political win for them. However, when you really look into it, right, it's now just become a states' right issue. So if California wants to be able to go, full crazy and allow people to abort right up until the moment of birth, they technically can. And if other states want to essentially try and make abortion as difficult to achieve as possible and encourage other forms of birth control, like condoms, abstinence, or considering adoption when it comes to unwanted pregnancies, again, they can go in that direction as an individual state. Um, it's fascinating to see this play out. I'm not sure if you guys are currently following a lot of the polling going on in the United States. And honestly, it's so hard for me to want to take any poll seriously, but it seems like right now the appears that there's the polls are starting to drift more and more Republican, where a couple weeks ago it seemed like it was drifting Democrat. Who knows whether you can actually take that at face value? I these days I pretty much never try and take a poll at face value because it seems like they get it wrong more often than you would expect, right? And all you need to look back to is the 2016 election in order to realize that pollsters get it dramatically wrong sometimes. Now let's jump to the Western Standard. This is going to kind of transition into our WTF stories. So Matthew Good, maybe you haven't thought about his name in a while, but obviously a very popular musician, has a large fan base, the Matthew Good Band. But this is actually a very shocking clip. I imagine he was trying to be funny here, but if the roles were reversed and this was, a right-leaning influencer or musician, I don't know if the media would be as forgiving of the statement or just be willing to overlook it. So watch. Good tells BC crowd freedom protesters should be sent to Congo and shot by teens with AKs. There's literally like a low quality video that you can watch here if you're so inclined in order to actually hear it from him. But yeah, that's pretty much what he says. And it's also interesting, like, why the Congo? And why do you believe that if someone's sent over to the Congo that they'll immediately be shot by teenagers with AKs? Kind of seems like could be a little bit presumptuous there, maybe even a little bit racist. And your thoughts about what the Congo is. But yeah, just bizarre, right? If you don't agree with me, you need to be killed. And honestly, I don't care whether you're on the left or right, but if that's your form of humor, if that's your kind of go-to in political positions, I'm not cool with that. And call me old-fashioned, but I'd much rather have public discourse. I'd much rather see people protest than take up arms. And understand if people don't feel their voices are being heard, right? If you constantly belittle and just denounce any of your critics, regardless of the validity of their arguments, and never even willing to take into consideration their position or perspective, you're just begging eventually for revolution here. And I would much rather a peaceful transition, but it's difficult at this moment in time to not feel like we're being constantly herded in one direction of either comply or you need to get into open conflict. Obviously, that's not what I'm calling for here, but I think that people need to understand that we should be able to have these nuanced conversations. Again, now, I think he technically should be allowed to tell a terrible joke like this. I just think that we should probably see more backlash from mainstream media because I believe that if he was a right leaning country music singer that said something similar, right? Whether that was about vaccinated people or immigrants or whatever, right? Pick your favorite boogeyman there. But if they were to say that, I feel like this would hit mainstream media. I feel like CBC would be talking about rightist extremists, where when a leftist makes this sort of joke, it maybe just falls on deaf ears. Now, let's jump over to Louder with Crowder. This one is bizarre. Humans, sometimes we go along to get along too much, in my humble opinion. But again, love to hear your thoughts. But this is wild from Louder with Crowder. Watch, legend stands outside building with a lit roller to illustrate how conditioned Americans are to comply. So maybe you've been to like a sporting event, an arena, whatever, a big gathering of people. Maybe they had metal detectors. Maybe you've gone through airport security and had to have someone wand you, right, as you were going through with a metal detector. Well, this dude's literally just standing in front of a building holding a lint detector, a lint roller, pretending that it's a metal detector wand. And everyone that came along, he would like kind of show them the wand and wand them down. Yeah, it, it's so concerning, our deference towards authority. I think so many people don't want to be responsible for their individual actions and decisions that they would rather just give up, lean in to whatever the populace wants or whatever the powers that be dictate versus trying to think critically. I would like to believe that I wouldn't be the person to comply with this. Like, especially, I'm pretty sure I can spot a lint roller versus a metal detector wand. And if someone was like, "Hey, I have to wand you down with this lint roller first," I'd be like, "That's a lint roller, bro." At least that's what I'd like to think. Who knows? You know what? If I was going through airport security, I'd probably go along with it because it seems like you've got no other option available. However, if I was walking down the street and going into one store and that was the case, I'd probably just skip that store and go on to the next store. But again, that's what I'd like to think. Until you're actually in that situation, it's difficult to know for sure. But if you guys want to watch the full video or read the full article, it's on the Louder with Crowder website. And reminder, every single day I'm posting all the links and all the show notes into our Telegram group. So if you haven't joined the Telegram group, it's completely free. There's no cost associated with it. So just go join. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. So we've got comments turned on in our Telegram chat as well. Reminder, all of our second halves of the shows where we do topic deep dives, that'll be in our Substack. And again, you can join Substack for free. We've got comments turned on for free. There's really no reason not to join unless you just simply hate our content, in which case I kind of question why you're even watching me right now. But yeah, we definitely live in clown world when this is the case. And honestly, at this moment in time, it feels like if a public health authority told us to all that we had to all walk or hop on one foot in order to fight COVID, to try and slow the spread, to flatten the curve, I sadly think that maybe half of the population would hop on one foot and simply they would trust in the science. Because we're moving at the speed of science, right? Another WTF story, this one again from Louder with Crowder. And this is when we get into government spending, it's random things like this. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not a ton of money that's being wasted on this program. It's the fact that they even think that they could justify spending a penny of taxpayer dollars on this. Biden and men funding drag shows in foreign countries to promote inclusion because, of course, they are. Fox News reports the State Department has awarded more than $20,000 for Ecuador to host drag theater performances in the name of diversity and inclusion. It includes 3 workshops, 12 drag shows, and a 2-minute documentary. I don't want any of my money going to drag shows. I don't care. If you want to have drag shows, you do you. But I don't want my money going to strippers, drag shows. I don't want my tax dollars essentially going to almost anything in general. But that's just the inner anarchist in me, because I don't believe some arbitrary politician that gets voted in by the tyranny of the majority actually can speak for me. I just don't believe in the magic make believe, the fantasy world of politics, democracy, and government. And yeah, it's why? Why on earth, right? You would think that there's better places in America you could spend that $20,000. And again, $20,000, that's not even a rounding error when it comes to government deficits and budgets, but it literally just shows the hubris of these individuals that they believe, like, it. Imagine being a politician and thinking that you're going to be a better steward of their dollars than taxpayers, and then you spend your money on this. It's not even for drag shows in America. Are you freaking kidding me? Next, let's jump over to True North. And again, I've got a lot of WTF stories today, guys. Maybe I just need to get a bunch of stuff off my chest. But this is from True North. Levy, Waterloo School Board pushes Pronouns Day on students. Now, again, weren't we like behind on educating this generation because of 2 years of lockdowns? I wouldn't think we'd even have time to explore that. We should be really focused on speech therapy, getting people back up to their current grade level of education, and focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic. But nope, Waterloo region wants to celebrate International Pronouns Day. I don't think any of the days should be like, maybe you can celebrate Canada Day. Outside of that, like, why are we celebrating all these random holidays? I don't think that there should be an Irish Pride Day. I don't think there should be Gay Pride Day. I don't think there should be any of these things in our school boards, in our schoolrooms. I think that the school system does such a poor job of educating children that they shouldn't be expanding the scope of their mandate. They should be looking to narrow it in. Let's narrow in our focus rather than broadening it to the point where we're essentially teaching them nothing, but trying to celebrate everything. So if you guys want to get your blood boiling, go read this article, because this is just pure silliness, in my opinion. And again, is this the end of the world as we know it? Absolutely not. But I do think it's indicative of where our culture is headed, right? So circling back to that earlier conversation this morning, I think that we all, as members of society, if we want to continue to see this society functioning to even the degree it currently is, we need to be good custodians. We need to be good stewards, and we need to actually be living in alignment with what our beliefs are. And I think a lot of people these days they're going limp. They're just going along to get along. And long term, there's real consequences to that, in my opinion. Excellent. CBC is not loading for me, but let's try this one more time, because I want to jump into the first story of the day. With reminder, the second half of this show, I'll be talking about hobbies, because it's Thursday and that's our hobby day. So I want to be sharing with you guys all my thoughts and all my favorite board games. If you guys didn't know, I'm actually a huge board game. Over the course of my 37 years here on the earth, I probably bought more than 200 board games. Really how big of a board game nerd I am. I remember when I first discovered like what's often referred to as like European strategy board games, which really just means like good board games. I was so enthralled and so addicted. I enjoyed just consuming everything board game related. So we're going to get into that in the second half of the show. I see Kyle Downs in the chat there saying Catan is always number one. I believe that's probably the greatest gateway drug when it comes to board games. At least that was the case for me. Once I discovered Catan, there was no going back. All right, come on, CBC. Well, we're going to jump. I've got a second tab here. I don't know what's Brave browser. Are you guys having issues with your Brave browser these days? I really like being able to use Brave because, hey, I'm not playing into the alphabet soup conglomerates of Google and all that. But here we are. Let's see if I copy paste this. Will this work? Again, let me know. Is this just like maybe I'm missing an update on my Brave browser? I don't know, but I'll continue to support Brave if I can. Anyways, jumping over to Zero Hedge, because thankfully I had to back up, not because I knew CBC was going to crash on me here, but just because I want to give two different perspectives on it. UK's Liz Truss resigns, becomes shortest tenured post-war PM. Will Bojo make a comeback? And obviously Bojo being Boris Johnson. So it is interesting, to say the least, that she essentially lasted 6 weeks here And one political pundit put it in a really interesting way. As one fellow Brit commented, 4 chancellors, 3 home secretaries, 2 monarchs, and now 3 PMs in 4 fucking months. Does seem pretty tumultuous over there in regards to UK politics. I've got no idea if that's going to continue to be the norm, but let's jump back to CBC News here first. So, British Prime Minister Liz Truss resigns. British Prime Minister Liz Truss announced on Thursday she was stepping down just over 6 weeks after taking the Conservative Party reins as leader. Now, you may be asking, why does this matter? But the reason she's stepping down, I think there's actually serious consequences here. And I don't know whether this is going to become political norm across the Western world, but this really seems to be the narrative, at least right now in the UK. And I suspect that Canada and the US may also fall victim to it. So we'll get into that in a sec. Truss's short tenure was marked by shock over the government's mini budget, which roiled British markets, and internal party dissension, leading to cabinet departures and backbenchers expressing a lack of confidence in their new leader. So again, this all essentially resulted around her proposed mini budget. The short-lived honeymoon for Truss effectively ended on September 23rd when Kwarteng's planned £45 billion, 70 billion Canadian in unfunded tax cuts sparked turmoil on financial markets, hammering the value of the pound and increasing the cost of UK government borrowing. The Bank of England was forced to intervene to prevent the crisis from spreading to the wider economy and putting pension funds at risk. So, from my perspective, what's playing out here right now is we're literally in the bond markets, the equity markets, the financial markets can dictate what goes on with public policy. Now, obviously, as a politician, there should be some consideration given to the economy, to the bond markets, to equity markets, and things of that nature. But it kind of feels like we're almost at the moment in time where big bankers, where hedge funds will be able to start dictating purely government policy as long as they're able to create enough turmoil in the markets. We saw previously the Bank of England, one of their department heads, I forget exactly what, directors, came out and said last week, and we talked about this, that they were giving like 3 days for this short-term liquidity they pumped into the system for insurers to get their shit in order, because these were always meant to be temporary measures. Honestly, we, the Western world, or just governments in general, are so addicted to liquidity, right? To fast and loose, cheap debt, that I don't know if we can ever get off of it. And I think that this is a sign, right? Whenever someone's looking towards austerity now, they're going to have to take in the political ramifications, and this really should be concerning because, yeah, I think a lot of our Western governments are headed off a cliff. As Okay, let's go on. Here's some charts and stuff if you guys want to sink your teeth into it, but I think there's a quote further on here I want to explore with you guys. Let's be clear. Ill-founded as Thatcherism on steroids was a proposed solution to the UK's structural problems, at least Truss was trying something. What we get now is a return to guaranteed technocrat institutional failure, because that was what we all agreed we had in place before COVID. Yeah, that certainly rings true in my humble opinion when we're looking at Truss's resignation here. And I think this whole quote's worthwhile, but I'm just going to cover the first paragraph. So this is a Bloomberg commenter. This may suit you now because Liz wasn't your cup of tea. Fine, I get it. She wasn't mine either. But all you have created is a precedent wherein no politician, be they left, right, center, or populist, ever be able to wrestle power back from the markets. When the bond vigilantes, plus a shouty Twitter mob, control political decision making, not politicians, we are basically in the hands of mob rule. The result will be the actual destruction of Britain. I agree with that, but let's take it a step further, because this isn't even like populism mob rule. This is like a small, corporate technocrat, high level bankers that are deciding to, dump on the markets. And now again, it's reasonable to think that markets should react to political news. However, to see politicians react to markets' reaction to their political moves, that's where we get into some weird consequence area, in my humble opinion. I love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions. I see we got Kohana jumping in with a few of their hot takes. Let's see, what do we got here? It's either Boris or a general election. Rishi Sunak is not an acceptable choice. They choose Truss because of her hawkish manner towards Russia. Yeah, it is interesting, right? And if we see a general election cost because of all this turmoil, again, this is just going to show that the markets have even more power over political discourse and political decision making. And it just like, I'm not going to be able to do it justice here, but like in general, we've got government fiat monetary policies, right? We've got central banking, and that's created essentially the handing over of our general economy and economic well-being to a handful of financial movers and market makers, right? And these are like uh, large banks, large hedge funds. Think of like the Black Rocks of the world. And when you start to like slice and dice it, you realize that it like I don't know whether it's always been this way or whether we fell into this form of crony capitalism, but it really should be concerning because we're on the cusp of a different level of technocrat that's going to be rolled out here. And if no government's capable of implementing austerity, then we're literally just going to be Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff, and we're going to continue to run for as long and far as possible. But eventually, there will be consequences to the bad decisions we make. And I don't know. Maybe it's better to put off things for as long as possible. Kind of a tangent here, but I recently started reading what's it called, Blood and Fire or Fire and Blood, the Targaryen backstory story from George or George R. Martin. Big fanboy of his. I've read all the Game of Thrones books. But in that, one of the interesting quotes near the start of the book is from Aegon the Conqueror, and he talks about why he decided to travel to all the corners of his realm on a yearly basis. And he said, much better to delay revolution than to um, uh, put down a revolution or something to that effect. And part of me wonders, maybe this is the case. Maybe had Truss had her way here, we would have had economic collapse immediately. But I personally feel like constantly putting off the economic collapse or the economic hardships that might come with us having to return to a more sound monetary policy and less fast and loose um, modern monetary theory. I just I think that eventually we're going to get to the point where the system can't be fixed. And I'd much rather see us slowly try and incrementally improve our existing system rather than having to start over from whole cloth, because I think that that's going to create very hard times for a significant portion of the population for a much more extended period of time than if we could somehow find a way to try and improve things incrementally. Again, that honestly could just be pure hopium on my part. I'm aware of it because part of me thinks that our systems are so decrepit, so captured by institutional players and by bureaucrats and technocrats and any type of crap, really, that they're all crap, in my opinion, that maybe it can't be fixed. And I literally, I'm like a pendulum. I switch back and forth on the daily on my perspective here. But anyways, let's move on because I've got the second story of the day I want to explore with you guys. This one's from Zero Hedge. CDC set to add COVID-19 vaccines to childhood immunization schedule. And I'm going to refresh you guys on what the Moderna CEO just said earlier this week, even though we covered it yesterday, because it bears repeating, particularly given the context of this article. So, and while left-wing fact checkers were quick to point out that this doesn't automatically mean schools will require students to take a jab, a decision made at the local level, even ABC News admits if the CDC does update its list of suggested vaccinations to include the COVID vaccine, which is available to anyone 6 months or older, that will open the door for states to begin making those calls too. And so I think that if we see the CDC do this, we're going to see a lot of states jump on board. And it doesn't make sense, particularly given the moment in time we find ourselves in. If you look at the context of all the information that's coming out, it seems more and more from literally the CEO of this pharmaceutical company that they're saying now it really is probably just going to be those at risk that should be taking the boosters, right? Those that are 50 plus, those with comorbidities, those with pre-existing health conditions that make them more susceptible to severe reactions to COVID-19. So it's wild to me that we find ourselves at this moment in time where we're headed towards this. And again, we covered it yesterday in regards to UWO's recent policies around essentially trying to force their students to wear masks for the rest of this term, and they have to get their booster by I think it was like mid-January of next year. So again, reminder: watch Moderna CEO admit, like seasonal flu, only vulnerable need jabs. So before we even share this quote again, this guy has every incentive to want to say that every person of the 8 billion population we have has to get this shot. And yet, even he isn't taking that extreme position anymore. Yet, somehow, our health officials, our politicians, the mainstream media are still taking the most extreme interpretation of these things. Now, is it just they're a little bit behind on the science? Are they not catching up as fast? Is this guy now filled? Is the CEO of the pharmaceutical companies now filled with misinformation? I can't help but want to speculate in regards to politicians decided better safe than sorry that that was probably the best path forward for their political careers, and that they could always point to someone else being at fault if that ended up being the case, where better the wrong action than inaction appears to be the mandate these days from politicians. And where I come from, when it comes to intervening in individuals' lives and affairs, you actually need a wild burden of proof on your end before you change the status quo. Particularly when you're headed towards more draconian, more tyrannical measures, right? And again, I understand why people maybe think things like the CDC updating their guidance for schools isn't, crazy draconian tyranny, but understand that there's consequences to what they say. When they choose to say that, we're going to immediately see a lot of blue states in the U.S. choose to enact these policies, right? Because again, this is their modern orthodoxy. It's literally become like, the branch COVIDians is what you'll hear a lot of people on Twitter refer to them as. But it's hard to distinguish how this is different than a cult. But reminder, here's the direct quote from the Moderna CEO. You might want to, but I think it's going to be similar to flu, where it's going to be people at high risk, people above 50 years of age, people with comorbidities, people with cancer and other conditions, people with transplants, the Moderna head added. And so, as we covered yesterday, this goes from 8 billion people, every single person needs to take it, to maybe like 1.5 billion. Well, we're no longer even talking about the majority of humans need to take it now, even according to the CEO of this pharmaceutical company. When the hell are politicians, when the hell is mainstream media going to catch up? They should have actually caught up a long time ago. They shouldn't be waiting for the CEO of the pharmaceutical company to tell them or give them their talking points. It just is absurd. I can't help but feel like the reason we've got the CEO coming out and being less hawkish, more of a dove in regards to these vaccines, is because he might actually someday have consequences in his life because of the decisions made here from public policy, where every politician lives with such certainty that they will never be held accountable for their decisions, or they are so blinded by their own hubris that they could never imagine being in the wrong. Wild, fucking wild times we find ourselves in my humble opinion. This is why I need a co-host here, because otherwise I just get on these rants. Yet another, and so we're going to jump into third story of the day. And there's a couple things that I really want to explore in regards to Canada's justice system. Obviously, no justice system is perfect, but it, it feels like there's some weird shit going on these days in Canada. Yet another pathetically weak sentence for a vicious crime makes a mockery of justice. This is from Spencer Fernando. Love his blogs. Really encourage you guys to check out his website if you haven't. Again, reminder, join the Telegram chat. That's where all the links to all these stories are. That's where you guys can also comment and give us your feedback on the story. And if there's stories that you think we should be covering here on BDE, jump into the Telegram chat. Share them with me. I would really appreciate it. In August 2017, the remains of 19-year-old Bhavkaran Desi were found in a vehicle in Surrey, BC. Her boyfriend, Harjit Singh Dio, was charged with attempting to burn her body. Dio pleaded guilty and was convicted of manslaughter and indignity to human remains. Dio was served 5 years in prison at most. Now, again, you killed your girlfriend. You tried to burn the body. 5 years max. It seems weird to me, right? Like, how long was Tamara Lynch held in custody because she dared to organize a protest in Ottawa? It wasn't 5 years. I'll give you that. But the fact that we see such a show trial around Tamara Lynch, and yet this individual will at max get 5 years for killing someone and trying to burn the evidence, burn their body. Further on, Spencer goes on to remind us about the situation with the mass stabbing. And even when people are locked up, the system just lets them back out again. Miles Sanderson had over 50 prior criminal convictions, yet was granted parole as the parole board said he wasn't a risk to the public. In September of 2022, he went on to stab 11 people to death in Saskatchewan. We have a system that views it as cruel to keep dangerous people locked up, yet somehow doesn't see the cruelty that kind of weakness imposes on innocent Canadians who end up paying the price. Yeah, it is bizarre how our justice system decides to work, right? Like we've literally seen comedians get in trouble here and charged in Canada, or charges put forward towards them in regards to jokes they made. We see parents being demonized by our political system and judicial system if they don't immediately embrace their child's new identity, pronouns, and sexual orientation. But at the same time, violent criminals are going to be violent criminals. We can't hold it against them because maybe they had a rough upbringing. And let's be clear here. Honestly, often case, this is a cycle of violence, right? So like someone that was brutalized as a child often goes on to be a brute themselves. And we do need to try and combat those systemic issues. But just having a revolving door when it comes to violent criminals in our judicial system, that's not the answer either. And I really don't think that our judicial system these days is looking at rehabilitating people. Instead, what we've taken is letting them loose is rehabilitation. And obviously, a lot of this even stems from mental health issues. And that's a complex discussion of itself because, was it back in the 70s when we kind of opened up the mental health institutions and let people out and decided like better than be homeless than a mental health institution? It is difficult, right? When and how and who gets to decide an individual is able to govern themselves and when they're a threat to themselves in society. That's a complex issue. I'm not going to solve it in today's video, but I don't think that we're having the right sort of discourse around these subject matters either in modern day society. And I think it's important that we at least attempt to have these conversations. Now let's jump over to the Western Standard, or sorry, I think this was via the Western Standard, but it's on the Burnaby Now website. A wake-up call. 5 Canadian police officers killed in 37 days. This stood out to me because I don't have the stats in front of me about how many police die in a given year, but certainly I don't think that we usually see 5 Canadian police officers killed in 40 days. I think that that's abnormal. A former police chief says the death should be a tipping point. He's calling for changes to better support people in their mental health. And so this really leads into that conversation around mental health issues. So again, if you want to understand the 5 different incidences that occurred here, I encourage you to jump over, Telegram chat, all that good stuff. But this really did stand out to me. And I was like, well, I wonder in general, what's going on with crime in Canada? Personally, you know, other than petty crime, I've never been a victim of crime. I really do believe that Canada's a very safe country. I grew up in a farm in the middle of nowhere, southwestern Ontario. We never locked our doors as a family. We eventually started locking our doors, and that was right after there was a mass killing less than a kilometer down the road from us. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But it is interesting. So, anyways, this led me to jumping over to wanting to look into some of the crime statistics from Statistics Canada. And I don't know, like as I was reading this, there was a bunch of different things that kind of like pulled me in different directions in regards to whether crime's getting better or worse in Canada. If you really pull out and look over decades, it does seem like we're drifting in the right direction. However, if you pull out only a decade, it doesn't feel like we're necessarily headed in a perfect direction either. So here's one of the charts. This is police reported crime severity indexes for Canada 2001 to 2021. So we can see from 2001 until about 2013, dramatic drop off. However, things start to trend up again up until around 2019, and then they kind of go down for certain types of crimes, but other crimes seem to be trending up. So for those of you that can't read this tiny chart, because I get it, the dark blue line here, this is crime severity index. The red is nonviolent crime severity index, and the light blue is violent crime severity index. So since 2013 or 2014, I should say, we've seen an increase in violent crime severity, and it seems to continue on into 2021. Now, I don't have a thesis on why this is occurring. It definitely should be concern for all of us, and I would love to see more thorough investigating by real journalists into this subject matter. I'm going to go on a little tangent here, guys. guys, so please indulge me. But speaking of this, you may remember that I was highlighting yesterday or 2 days ago that Toronto Star opinion piece that I really got frustrated by because they referred to ivermectin as horse dewormer. At the time, I couldn't remember what the exact stats are, but understand over a 250 million humans every single year consume ivermectin. In nature.com, there's an article from 2011 that refers to ivermectin as the miracle drug for the poor. And yet, in a Toronto Star opinion piece, we've got a journalist, using quotes here, going on to refer to it as horse paste. So again, maybe it's not effective, right? Like, it seems like a mixed bag if you're trying to really get down to the bottom of whether ivermectin's effective or not, but it doesn't seem like it's a negative. So again, if it's only a placebo, if it's a sugar pill in regards to treating COVID-19, it's not really all that harmful in the big scheme of things. Now, if people are thinking it's a magic drug and a cure-all, maybe that is a little bit of concern. But it's not simply horse paste. And that frustrates me to no end. And so I go on Twitter and looking up this journalist. They don't have a big following. I forget which college it is, but they're literally a teacher teaching journalism. And I was just like, you gotta be shitting me. Like, what sort of journalistic standards do you have if in an opinion piece, you're not even going to bother to actually look into ivermectin, but instead you're going to use an old talking point from CNN from like, what was it, like a year ago now that originally broke into the mainstream discourse? Just wild and embarrassing. But anyways, let's circle back to some of the crime statistics here. So I'm just going to read the headlines, but again, encourage you guys spend some time on this if you're interested. Sharp rise in the rate of police reported level 1 sexual assaults. Continued increase in offenses related to criminally harassing and threatening behaviors. Police reported hate-motivated crimes rise sharply for second year in a row. Rates of violent, non-violent criminal code firearm offenses up for a 7th consecutive year. National homicide rate increases for 3rd consecutive year. Rates of homicide are higher among Indigenous people and people designated as racialized. Again, designated as racialized. What crazy 1984 language we use these days. Police reported opiate offenses continue to increase during the pandemic. And honestly, I think the opiate crisis is something that is not given nearly enough serious consideration here in Canada. There was a story, I don't think I ended up putting it in any of our previous show notes, but I believe that there was a drug bust in Texas where I think it was over 342 million lethal doses of fentanyl were captured or taken by the state. That's literally enough to kill every human in America with those fentanyl doses. Um, like, part of me is actually shocked that more people aren't dying from fentanyl these days, based upon like my real basic oversimplistic research I've done into it. Another line here in regards to crime in Canada: continued decrease in rates of breaking and entering, 5,000 or under in robbery. So it's just interesting. It seems like more severe crimes are occurring at a greater level, but number of like lesser crimes and petty crimes are decreasing. Why is that? Literally, I don't even have a thesis here, guys. I'll throw it out to you. But why is that the case here in Canada? I guess if I was to speculate, maybe it's because people don't like. I don't think that we're as bad as California, for the record, in regards to our judicial system. But in California, if this was the case, and we're seeing like petty crimes decrease, but crimes of violent severity increase, I would probably speculate that in California, the cause of that would be their policies, right? That they're not going to charge anyone anyways. And you literally have police saying like, hey, if it's a crime under $1,000, don't call us. I don't know that that's the case in Canada, but that certainly would be something worth investigating, in my opinion. Now, let's jump over to our last story of the day. This is around Ukraine. And then, reminder, in the second half of the show, I'm going to get into one of my favorite hobbies, which is strategic board games, and share with you guys some of my thoughts and recommendations. But kind of feels like I haven't seen a lot of news around Ukraine recently. But it seems like things are still heating up on that front. This is from Zero Hedge, courtesy of Tyler Durden. 1/3 of Ukraine's power stations destroyed as WHO warns of brutal winter ahead. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announced Tuesday that up to 1/3 of all power stations have been attacked by Russian missiles and drone strikes over the past week, causing massive blackouts across the country. Now, this is something that we've kind of discussed and speculated in the past, was that Putin wasn't going with all-out warfare. Despite the claims that the Russian military was committing genocide, and honestly, I think it's very hard in the heat of battle to get to the bottom of whether that's occurring or not. I think it's only with hindsight that we'll really be able to tell whether that's the case. It seemed like he wasn't going total warfare, right? He wasn't trying to completely destroy all the infrastructure in Ukraine, and he wasn't trying to get them to completely capitulate to Russia. However, it seems like there's been an escalation with some of the attacks and terrorist attacks that the Ukrainian government, or maybe those associated with the Ukrainian government, or maybe it's other intelligence agencies. Again, it's so goddamn hard to actually know what the hell's going on in an active conflict zone. But it seems like Russia is stepping up the severity of their attacks. And again, I think this is just putting Europe and Ukraine, absolutely in particular in this case, and in a situation for a terrible winter. Again, only with hindsight, we'll know the real consequences here. But I suspect that a lot of people are going to die. A lot of people are going to become injured. A lot of people are going to become sick because of this continuing conflict, right? And yeah, I guess that's all I got to say on that. But let's jump over to the Western Standard for one other perspective on the Ukrainian front. Russia declares martial law in four newly annexed Ukrainian regions. So Russian President Vladimir Putin declared martial law in the four regions of Ukraine Moscow annexed on Wednesday. Additional emergency powers have also been given to the heads of all Russian regions. The order, which will take effect Thursday, gives law enforcement agencies 3 days to submit specific proposals, if also orders the creations of territorial defense forces in the four regions. So just want to kind of give a general update on that, some headlines that caught my attention in regards to what's going on in Ukraine. This seems like this is going to be a quagmire for an extended period of time. Again, only with hindsight will we know if this turns out to be another Afghanistan, another Vietnam, or whether it's maybe a Syria or an Iraq. But either way, I think Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and to a lesser extent, Western Russians are all going to be the worst for this continuing conflict. And the fact that it constantly sounds like from both sides, there's no turning back. Where does that lead us, right? I don't think it leads us anywhere good. But anyways, that's it for the last 24-hour news stories. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, smash the like button, hit subscribe. If you're watching this on Rumble, leave us a comment. I don't think anyone's left me a comment yet on Rumble. It would just make my day. And yeah, that's it. Encourage you guys, join the Telegram chat. We're going to go into our 2-minute break here, and then I'll be back hanging out with you guys talking about one of my favorite passions, strategic board games. All right, so appreciate you guys, and we'll be back in 2.5 minutes.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play. Educate, motivate, entertain and demonstrate. Health, wealth, relationships and legacy we elevate. Every day is what you make it, so don't take it and waste it. Never too late to save it. Remember, roses grow from pavement. Let me break this down to layman's. Just wanna live outrageous, build my way to greatness. Gotta speak my truth and face it. Hear the basis lies, gotta challenge it and break it. Take a shot of truth, chase it with some motivation. The best day ever, the best day ever. We gon' squad up, have the best day together. Best day ever, best day ever. We gon' squad up, go harder than any weather. What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually try matter what the weather say. Life is like a record, so just let it play. Best Day Ever Media. Song by Dan the Lost Boy.
All right, guys, we are back, and we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subject matters, board games. So first things first, if when you hear board games and you immediately cringe, or you're like, oh, I hate board games, I hate Monopoly, I hate Risk, I hate Sorry. One, you haven't been exposed to good board games. Although I don't actually mind Monopoly or Risk. They're probably the best of like the traditional board games, in my opinion, but they pale in comparison to modern day, what are often referred to as like Euro games or strategic games. There's a huge industry around this, and tons of fun and fascinating games. But before we get into my different recommendations, and I'm going to go through like, my favorite games. I'm going to share with you guys the best beginner board games if you're kind of new to the idea. I'd love to just share my general thoughts on board games and why I became such a fan of them. So again, always enjoyed Monopoly, even as a kid, and Risk as soon as I discovered it. I can remember taking my Risk board game into university, my first year in living in res, and like we played Risk as a floor, right? So like five guys would get together from the floor. I forget what, I think you can have six players in Risk. And we'd play there. I can remember introducing it to probably like a dozen people on my floor. And one night in particular, there was a very heated game of Risk going on. And two guys that were literally like thick as thieves, they were BFFs forever, had a huge blowout literally because of Risk, because one backstabbed the other. And essentially he was like, this is going to date me, but it's like, I want my CDs back. I want my DVDs back. You're never allowed in my room again. I can't trust you. Obviously, that's an extreme version of the sort of fun you can have when it comes to board games. But what really drew me into board games was as I entered my mid 20s and late 20s, like you go from like house parties where the goal is just kind of get blackout drunk or go to clubs or whatever, to, at least for me, like wanting something a little bit more, right? Like maybe stimulating my brain a little bit, forcing myself to think while still getting intoxicated. And that's where board games came in and were just the perfect fit. In my probably early mid 20s, friends of mine were just addicted to Settlers of Catan. And we'll get to Settlers of Catan further in a second. But I can remember going over to their house, partying and stuff, and they'd usually be playing Settlers, but they'd always like start the game before I got there because I was the only, like one of the only ones coming that wasn't living there or living close by. And so eventually I like weaseled my way and got there early and was able to play Catan. And from the first game I played, I was just addicted. I was obsessed with it, and went on. I've literally probably played hundreds, if not like thousands, maybe, of games of Settlers at this point in time. And what I really enjoy is, most strategy games, unless you're getting like really deep into, intense strategy games. And I'll share like two of the most intense games that I've only like on a couple occasions been able to bring together a big enough group and convince enough people to play with me. And I'll tell you all about those games in a little bit. But with most of these games, particularly the games I'm going to share with you, that are the introduction to Euro games or strategy board games. Once you learn the basic rules, and most of them are relatively simple, you can still like hang out with your friends. You can still have lively conversations. You can still get intoxicated, whatever your jam happens to be. But it's still also a little stimulating, and it even just like kind of gives you something to talk about rather than just like, hey, how was your week? How was your week? Da, 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 da. So again, you guys know I hate small talk. I love big talk. But if we're not going to only have big talk, then I'd rather distract myself with a board game than simply a TV show or just trying to get blackout drunk as fast as possible. So I'm going to pull up here. This is from our Substack. Again, it's completely free. Go over and join it. You can hit the like button. I'm usually the only one hitting the like button these days, but if you hit it too, that'll make my day. But board games, spoiler alert, Matt's a huge board game nerd. So first, I want to share with you guys some of my favorite resources when it comes to board games, and then we'll get into recommendations. So first things first, Board Game Geek. I don't think there's a more comprehensive website in regards to board games than Board Game Geek. BGG's been around forever, very thorough. I'm not active really anymore in the board game scene other than just playing with friends occasionally, but there was a time when I spent a lot of time here researching board games, getting an understanding of what games were best for me, what games would be funnest for my group to play. If you want to learn everything board game related, if you want to learn about a game or see all the components, understand the gameplay before buying it, this is the go-to resource in my humble opinion. Next, and I forgot to pull this up here, but let's quickly pull it up, is I think it's Games and Sundry. Or maybe actually, did the link work here? Yeah. So Games and Sundry. This is Will Wheaton's. I don't know if Will Wheaton's it, but like 5-10 years ago he was. Geez, maybe has it been 10 years? How long has this been around? 2011. Geez, yeah, it's been 10 years. But back in, I want to say, like the mid teens and late teens of 21st century, he was absolutely crushing it with his gameplay. He'd bring in his friends and like micro influencers and stuff like that to play board games. It was really fun because again, this allowed you to understand or see a game, see how it's played, see how people enjoy the level of strategy or the level of complexity. Just going to look here quickly at like the most popular ones, but like like I remember watching this Munchkin, Small World, pretty much any of these ones with the thumbnails. These are the best in my opinion. The old school thumbnails, like 10 years ago. God, how the time flies. But anyways, really encourage you guys, check it out, Geek and Sundry, if you want to watch gameplay and stuff like that. There's probably a whole host of channels now that do this thing, but back in the day in 2011 when I first started watching, this was top tier. And then finally, there's also, I think originally I remember this as a podcast, and then it became a website and a YouTube channel. But the Dice Tower is another fantastic resource. Really encourage you guys to jump over there and check it out. But those are like the 3 best board game resources to the best of my knowledge. But like I said, been kind of out of the scene for a little. Jump in the chat, jump in the Telegram, or you can leave a comment on this Substack post because, hey, you don't even need to actually pay to join the Substack or leave a comment. So right now, no paywall. Here's a little photo of Settlers of Catan, one of my favorite all-time games. And one of the reasons Settlers, in my opinion, is like top tier when it comes to board games is it's got the perfect balance, in my opinion, of strategy and luck. And it can be really hard for a lot of games to balance that appropriately. It's sometimes fun when a game has almost no luck elements to it. And I'll get into a couple game recommendations that essentially involve no luck. But there's also games that have far too much luck. And it can be very frustrating if you actually want to try to win, right? Or if you want to try and beat your friends at games purely luck. So, like, this game isn't purely luck, but like think of Yahtzee, right? It's the luck of the dice for the vast majority. There's a tiny little bit of strategy you can apply in regards to what you decide to do based upon your first rolls and what scores you kind of take in the first couple rounds. But outside of mainly the luck of the dice, there's not a lot you can do to put yourself in a better position when it comes to Yahtzee. But my recommendation for beginner board games, and I would encourage you guys, if you're looking to get into board games, just buy 1 or 2 of these base games. You don't need to buy a bunch of expansions in order to get the full fun out of the game. I used to call this the Holy Trinity, but I've added King of Tokyo to it subsequently. But I think Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne, King of Tokyo, and Ticket to Ride. Those are like the 4 best board games possible, in my opinion. Some of these are like so simple. Actually, all of them technically are so simple that you could probably teach them to an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, and they're going to get the fundamentals. They might not be able to out strategize you in regards to it, but they'll be able to follow along with the rules. They're not terribly complex. I would say Ticket to Ride and King of Tokyo are probably the best ones if you're particularly looking to introduce younger players to strategy board games. And Carcassonne and Settlers, I think, are fantastic for anyone that kind of enjoys at least aspects of Monopoly or enjoys aspects of Risk, but want to sink their teeth into something that's just a little bit more strategy oriented. So Settlers of Catan, that's the photo here. Definitely just like flat out my favorite game of all time, the board game I played the most games of. Carcassonne is way underrated in my opinion. So Settlers of Catan, if I had to describe it, it's like a kind of like a city building thing. There's no direct conflict, and actually, other than King of Tokyo, there's no direct conflict in any of these games. So if you're concerned about like, destroying the other person or beating them up or making them feel bad, that's really not going to be the case, at least for 3 of these games. The King of Tokyo, there's a little bit more direct conflict where you're like fighting each other. But we'll also get into a handful of games where it's literally co-op. games. So like it's cooperative where it's you guys versus the board game rather than like having to team up against each other. So again, there's a board game for every type of person these days. Settlers of Catan, though, highly recommend. Carcassonne, really fun, like tile laying game that when you first start to play it, you'll think you've got the strategy, and then you'll start to learn, like, oh shit, like there's levels to this stuff. So again, I love it. All these games like have um, uh, total replay value. Like they don't diminish over time. In fact, you'll just learn more and more nuances to it, despite the fact, as I said, that the rules are very simple and easy to get into. King of Tokyo, again, probably my number one recommendation for younger players. Essentially, in King of Tokyo, what you're doing is, well, I guess I should explain what each of them are. Settlers of Catan, you're literally settling an island, you're building up your resources and economy. So if you love like basic, turn-based strategy games, Settlers of Catan, you're going to feel right at home. Carcassonne, and again, Settlers of Catan, think of it as like a really watered down version of the game Civilization without tech trees and stuff like that. Carcassonne is essentially based upon, I think it was a region or a castle in France, if I'm not mistaken. But essentially, you're laying down tiles, claiming tiles with your meeples, which are like little people. And essentially, you're trying to score the most number of points. Same with Settlers of Catan. It's a points game. King of Tokyo, essentially, you're a monster attacking Tokyo, right? So think like Godzilla or whatever all the names are to the Godzilla franchise of monsters. And essentially, there usually can only be one or two kings of Tokyo, depending on whether you're playing with 4 or 6 players, if I remember correctly. But it is more confrontational. So if you really don't want people like rolling dice against each other and trying to like beat up the other guy, King of Tokyo may not be for you, but I think it's great for kids. Ticket to Ride is essentially a I don't know what the term for it would be, but it's kind of like a card playing game where what you're trying to do is build rail lines. So, if you're a big fan of like railroad simulators or things like this is the most watered down version of a railroad simulator that you're likely to find. Again, very simple rules, but there are levels of complexity to the strategy. So, if you're playing these games with all new beginners, you guys will have fun, easily be able to understand the rules. But if you're playing with if you want advanced, tough strategies, all you need to do is play against better players, right? More experienced players. And you'll find that there's lots of gameplay value out of all these games, indefinitely, in my opinion. Although I'd say Settlers and Carcassonne probably best bang for the buck in regards to replayability. I've never got sick of either of those games. But if you want to get a little bit more into intermediate strategy board games, if you've already had your fill of Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne, King of Tokyo, and Ticket to Ride, this is a handful of some of my favorite games that are what I'm going to call intermediate. So Seven Wonders, it's kind of like a card playing, deck building sort of game. And the goal is to essentially like build wonders, score points. Again, relatively simple, but as you start to understand the mechanics of like how to, proactively kind of block your competition, stuff like that, it'll allow for like a greater understanding of more in-depth strategy. Pandemic, this is one of those cooperative games where it's literally you guys versus the board game. Pandemic was, I think, the first cooperative board game I ever played. My gaming group absolutely fell in love with it. And essentially what you're trying to do is stop a world pandemic. I mean, it's too bad that some of our political leaders didn't play it in advance. Maybe we'd be in a better spot today. Dominion. This is another like deck building game. A little bit more like Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that. But unlike Magic the Gathering, you're not going to have to spend all your money on expensive booster packs to try and outbeat the competition. You can just buy this box game and that's that. You're not going to have to constantly chase the new more powerful cards and try and spend your way to success. The Resistance. So this is a game where essentially there's traders amongst you and you're trying to figure out who the traders are. So some of your fellow game players will be traders. This is a whole genre of games at this point in time. Avalon. There's one with like dwarves and mining. I can't think of it right now, but it's literally over there on my shelf of board games. But the Resistance is more of like a party game. So if you guys like want to be a little bit more fun, if you want to get to yell at other people or theorize about how they're the bad guy or evil, if you enjoy like tricking people, the Resistance is going to be absolutely up your alley. Really encourage. Saboteur would be another game that maybe you're more familiar with. And again, love playing the Resistance. And this is a game where like there is levels to the strategy. I remember I joined a gaming group in London, Ontario at a local board game a store where essentially I think it was like every Monday people would go and there'd be dozens of us there. And there's this one like group or clique of people that played the Resistance. And like it just if you were new to the game, you couldn't even like there was no way you could win because they understood they mainly played Avalon, which is just kind of a version of the Resistance, but like they understood every intricacies and like they understood the double cross and the backstab and all that. So again, most of these games have a lot of replayability as you personally evolve and your group of game players evolve in regards to understanding the nuances of the strategy. Betrayal at House on the Hill. This is such a fun game. It starts off as a cooperative game, but then eventually evolves into like a one versus many game. And again, so much fun. Really encourage you guys. If you've ever seen the movie Cabin in the Woods, that's essentially what this game is. Betrayal at House on the Hill, where like there's essentially 50 different scenarios, and it gives so much different replayability to the game because of those. You can buy expansions that give you more scenarios to play out, but it's just a lot of fun. It's weird. Now, this game getting a little bit more complex. You're going to be like reading pages in order to fully understand the game, where the rest of the games above, they're not that level of complexity. So if you hate reading, if you hate complexity in board games, Betrayal at House on the Hill is probably starting to get outside the scope of games that you're going to like. Evolution. This is a game where you start off like with like basic mammal creatures and you add on traits to them. This game I originally backed on Kickstarter. Absolute huge fanboy of Evolution. There's been a couple expansions that really add levels of complexity as well. And there's enough strategy here that it can take a while to really get your sea legs in regards to Evolution. A little bit more reading when it comes to the rules as well. Then Dead Panic. Really love Dead Panic. There's a bunch of different zombie-oriented board games, so Dead Panic may not be your favorite, but it was one of my favorites. Also, one of the few ones that I had. I think Dead of Winter is another great one that we used to play as well. But in Dead Panic, essentially, you and your team, and if I remember correctly, it starts out again as cooperative, where it's you guys versus everyone else usually. Although there's different ways you can kind of play with the scenarios, but I think eventually one of you or multiples of you can end up becoming the zombies and bad guys. But essentially, what it is you and your team are locked in a cabin and you're trying to fight off crazy zombie hordes. And I forget whether you're trying to collect items in order to do something, but eventually what you're going to do is like try and call a vehicle to come rescue you and escape. It's a lot of fun. And again, more like Betrayal at House on the Hill, you're going to have to read some shit. So if that's not up your alley, it may not be the best game to get into from an intermediate standpoint. But now let's get into like rich strategy games. Puerto Rico, probably my favorite rich strategy game. This is a game where there's no dice. There's technically no luck other than how other players play. So again, you can sometimes get like weird random situations where people chase weird strategies, and that can impact your ability. But essentially, you're starting a colony in Puerto Rico, and you're trying to build up the most robust economy and score the most points. This is the game that we'd almost always play, at least one game of it with like my group of like intense board game friends. So again, highly recommend you guys check out Puerto Rico if you're looking to sink your teeth into a deeper strategy game. Then there's Caverna. Again, these are getting into like big complex games. You're probably going to spend at least an hour and a half, 2 hours playing Caverna at this point in time, where most of the other games I've shared with you up until this point, I guess that would have been useful. My beginner and introductory games here, these will all take an hour or less usually. Settlers of Catan, if you've got like really good people playing, it sometimes will drag out. Most of these games here are going to be an hour-ish. Betrayal at House on the Hill, Dead Panic, Evolution, you're starting to get more into like an hour and a half sort of territory, maybe even sometimes bumping up to 2 hours with Betrayal at House on the Hill in particular. Puerto Rico, probably an hour and change. Caverna, hours. So you're committed to this. And Lords of Waterdeep, again, we're talking hours there in regards to the games. There's a lot more reading and nuances to it. There's a lot of different like buildings and strategy types, and it can take multiple gameplays before you even fully understand how the game fully works. But if you want to go full blown game nerd, this is the game for you, in my humble opinion. Also, just let me know, what is your favorite board game? So jump in the comments section, whether you're watching this live or on the replays. join the Telegram chat and let me know what are your favorite board games, because I'm always looking for fun recommendations. And if Sorry's your favorite board game, I honestly feel sorry for you because you don't know good board games. But let's get into the last category here. And so these are Matt's favorite crazy in-depth strategy board games that almost no one is crazy enough to say yes to. So Civilization. Yeah, if you're thinking about the video game, that's essentially what this is, but in board game form. So like if you don't like having to read pages of rules, break out calculators, we played this maybe 3-4 times max in my entire life. And I think the shortest we never like finished a game, but probably the shortest game we ever had was 3 or 4 hours. And then the longest game probably was like 8 or 10 hours. So again, like if you want to go full blown nerd, this is it. And I just realized there's one game I forgot to list on here that I'm going to get to next is Firefly. So if you love Firefly, the Joss Whedon TV series, or Serenity, I think was the movie that came out after it. Literally, again, Firefly is like a 2 to 4 hour board game. You build your own ship, you go and run missions, you're trying to like level up, all that stuff, score the most points, if I remember correctly. We only played that game a couple times too, because again, it can be hard sometimes to find like-minded individuals that want to sometimes spend a day learning the rules to then spend the next day playing the game. And then there's Diplomacy. Diplomacy is this really unique game. It's an old game too, which is kind of surprising. And there's not a ton of rules, but there's a lot of negotiations. And so essentially, if I remember correctly, I think it's the start of World War One, and you take over one of the major powers in World War One, and your goal is to like take over the world or defeat your enemies. And it's not as like the conflict aspect of it isn't really as significant as the diplomacy, hence the name, or the negotiations. And so it's all about like backstab and subterfuge and tricking people and double crosses. Again, if you enjoy that sort of thing, think of Diplomacy as like Risk plus the Resistance or Avalon. That's probably the easiest way I could describe it. I remember I mentioned at that board game meetup that I used to go to way back in the day. That would have been like in 2015, 2016. I mentioned to one of the girls there that I owned Diplomacy, but never found like 6 people crazy enough to play it with me. And they had all wanted to play it, but no one had the board game. So I brought it like the following week and we set up the game. I think we played for like 2 hours. We barely even got into the game because, again, there's so many complexities and it's a slow paced game for a lot of it. And one guy walking by, an older game board nerd, was like, "You guys are playing Diplomacy?" And we're like, "Yeah, we're so excited. Da, da, da." And he's like, "You must really hate each other because you're definitely not going to like each other after this." So again, not all these games, especially when we get into the deeper strategy games, are going to be for everyone. But as I mentioned, I'm a huge board game nerd. I just want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you guys one of my favorite hobbies, because that's what these Thursday shows are all about. Recently, I introduced Adam and Christina, so Adam Martin, who's my usual co-host, to the show, to Civilization, to Settlers of Catan. They absolutely loved it. They've been playing it nonstop. They're about to come back up here to the Citadel. I've got a handful of games I'm going to introduce them to. I think probably Carcassonne will be the next one that I get them playing, but I hope to actually get them into some of the intermediate games. Maybe we'll even try one of the more in-depth strategy games as well. But anyways, that's it for this Hobbies Day. Again, appreciate you guys watching, hanging out with me. If you enjoy these Wednesdays, let us know in the comment section. Smash the like button, all that good stuff. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me. I hope you have the best day ever. And honestly, I think getting a small group of friends together and playing board games is a recipe for having the best day ever. All right, that's it, guys. I appreciate you. I'll be back tomorrow with another 24-hour news cycle. Have a great day.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your